There is a theory in paleontology, since largely discredited, that the Tyrannosaurus rex hunted by detecting movement. Stand still, the idea went, and the predator would not see you. Move, and you became prey. This theory entered popular culture through a famous film scene and persisted despite scientific evidence that the dinosaur's vision was, in fact, quite acute. The metaphor has outlived the science because it captures something recognizable about a certain type of threat. There are predators who seem to pursue whatever moves, who interpret stillness as absence and motion as invitation, who advance until they encounter resistance, then probe for weakness elsewhere. European leaders have spent the past year testing a hypothesis about how to manage the second Trump administration. The hypothesis was that careful diplomacy, strategic flattery, and selective accommodation could preserve the transatlantic relationship while protecting core European interests. Trade deals could be negotiated, tariffs could be absorbed, rhetorical provocations could be managed through back channels. The assumption underlying this approach was that Trump, despite his unpredictability, remained fundamentally a transactional figure who could be satisfied with the right combination of concessions and gestures. That hypothesis has now been tested to destruction. On Saturday, Trump announced 10% tariffs on 8 NATO allies, rising to 25% by June, conditioned on the complete and total purchase of Greenland by the United States. This was not a negotiating position. This was not an opening bid in a trade dispute. This was economic coercion aimed at compelling a sovereign nation to surrender territory. And it came after a year in which European leaders did everything the appeasement playbook suggested. They struck trade deals. They increased defense spending. They avoided public criticism. They sought personal relationships with Trump and his inner circle. None of it mattered. The predator kept advancing. The pattern is now clear enough that continuing to ignore it requires willful blindness. Trump does not respond to accommodation by becoming more accommodating. He responds to accommodation by demanding more. Each concession signals weakness. Each compromise confirms that pressure works. The logic is not complicated. It is the logic of the schoolyard bully extended to great power relations. Those who back down get pushed further. Those who push back get left alone. The only variable is how much pain each party is willing to absorb. Mary Trump, the president's niece and a psychologist by training, posted her assessment on social media Sunday night. Quoting a headline about European officials leaning toward negotiating rather than retaliating, she wrote that she was tired of the failed strategy of negotiation and appeasement. It only empowers him, she said. Fight back. This was not diplomatic analysis. It was personal testimony from someone who has observed the subject for decades. The advice was not gentle, but it aligned with what game theorists and international relations scholars have been arguing for months. Robert Jervis, the late Columbia professor whose work on deterrence remains foundational, distinguished between two types of states in international relations. Status quo states seek to preserve existing arrangements. Revisionist states seek to overturn them. The appropriate strategy for dealing with each is different. With a status quo state, diplomatic reassurance and military restraint avoid unnecessary escalation. With a revisionist state, appeasement only leads to more aggression. The only thing that works is credible deterrence, the demonstrated willingness and capacity to impose cost. The Trump administration has made its revisionist intentions explicit. The president has declared his intention to acquire Greenland, using the easy way or the hard way. He has not ruled out military force. He has demanded the territory of a NATO ally while threatening tariffs if that ally resists. His Secretary of State has dismissed concerns about sovereignty. His vice president excoriated Europe as woke and anti-democratic at the Munich Security Conference last February. The national security strategy released in November doubled down on the scorn. This is not a government that can be mollified through strategic deference. The European response to Saturday's announcement has been rhetorically unified, but strategically uncertain. 8 countries issued a joint statement warning of a dangerous downward spiral. Emmanuel Macron declared that no intimidation or threat would influence France. Keir Starmer called the tariff threat completely wrong. Friedrich Merz urged dialogue. Giorgia Meloni, despite her close relationship with Trump, called the tariffs a mistake. The words were strong, but words are not strategy. The strategic question facing Europe is straightforward in principle, though agonizing in practice. Should the European Union deploy the Anti-Coercion Instrument, the most powerful trade weapon in its arsenal, against the United States? Should it reimpose the 93 billion euros in retaliatory tariffs it prepared last year, but suspended after the Turnberry Agreement? Should it restrict American companies from public procurement contracts, limit trade licenses, and impose financial penalties that would genuinely hurt American interests? Or should it continue seeking dialogue, hoping that Trump will moderate his demands, or that some face-saving compromise can be found? France has been pushing for the aggressive option. French Finance Minister Roland Lescure said the EU must be prepared to use its anti-coercion mechanism. Macron reportedly asked the European Council to activate the instrument during Sunday's emergency meeting. France has traditionally advocated for a more independent European role in continental security. It is less export-dependent than Germany, and it has a president who has tried to cultivate a personal relationship with Trump and watched that relationship produce nothing but further demands. Germany has been more cautious. Chancellor Friedrich Merz warned that a tariff war would hurt both sides of the Atlantic. He said he is trying to persuade Macron to tone down his response. Germany's calculation is different from France's. German exports to the United States totaled $236 billion in 2024. German automakers have already absorbed massive tariff costs. The German economy is more vulnerable to American retaliation than the French economy. And Germany, unlike France, does not have nuclear weapons or a seat on the UN Security Council. Its leverage comes from economic integration, and economic integration cuts both ways. This Franco-German divide has been a consistent feature of European responses to American pressure. France pushes for confrontation. Germany counsels accommodation. The rest of Europe watches while the two largest economies disagree. And Trump continues advancing because the lack of a unified response signals that Europe is not serious about imposing costs. The theoretical argument for confrontation is compelling. The Anti-Coercion Instrument was designed precisely for this scenario. It allows the European Commission to determine that economic coercion is taking place, then impose a range of countermeasures including tariffs, service restrictions, public procurement bans, investment limits, and intellectual property penalties. The threshold for activation is straightforward. A third country uses economic measures to pressure an EU member state into a policy change. Trump's conditional tariffs, explicitly tied to Denmark surrendering Greenland, meet this definition unambiguously. Activation would send a signal that Europe is willing to absorb costs to defend its members. It would demonstrate that the trade bazooka is not merely rhetorical. It would establish a precedent that economic coercion against EU members triggers a coordinated response, and it would impose real pain on American companies and consumers, creating domestic political pressure on Trump to de-escalate. The argument against confrontation is equally compelling. Europe cannot win a trade war with the United States. American GDP is larger. American financial markets are deeper. American consumers are less dependent on imports than European consumers. The dollar's reserve currency status gives America financing advantages that Europe cannot match. A full-scale economic confrontation would hurt Europe more than America, even if Europe deployed every tool at its disposal. Moreover, confrontation risks escalation across multiple domains. The United States still provides the nuclear umbrella that undergirds European security. American intelligence sharing supports Ukrainian operations against Russia. American participation in any peace agreement with Moscow remains essential for enforcement. If Europe turns the trade relationship into open warfare, Trump might respond by accelerating the withdrawal of American security commitments. The costs of confrontation could include not just economic damage, but a fundamental rupture of the alliance that has protected Europe since 1949. This is the dilemma that has paralyzed European strategy. Appeasement does not work, but confrontation is dangerous. Neither path leads to a good outcome. The question is, which path leads to a less bad outcome, and over what time horizon? One school of thought argues that Europe should absorb the short-term costs of confrontation because the alternative is worse. If Trump learns that tariff threats produce European capitulation, he will use tariff threats again and again. The pattern will repeat until Europe has surrendered everything valuable. Better to establish boundaries now, accept the economic damage, and demonstrate that there are limits beyond which coercion will not succeed. The pain will be significant, but it will be finite. The pain of indefinite appeasement would be infinite. Another school of thought argues that Europe should wait. Trump's presidency has a term limit. His domestic political position may weaken. The Supreme Court may constrain his tariff authority. Market pressures may force reconsideration. Congress may intervene. Some combination of internal American checks may produce moderation that European pressure cannot achieve. Why absorb the costs of confrontation when time might solve the problem? The waiting strategy has a certain appeal to risk-averse leaders. It allows them to avoid difficult decisions while maintaining hope that circumstances will change. But it also allows Trump to set the terms of every interaction. It concedes initiative, and it assumes that European interests will not be damaged beyond repair in the interim. The evidence from the past year suggests that waiting has not worked. Europe waited after the initial tariff threats in February 2025. It waited after the Liberation Day tariffs in April. It waited after the Munich Security Conference speech. It waited after the national security strategy. At each stage, European leaders hoped that Trump would moderate. At each stage, he escalated instead. The Greenland ultimatum is not a departure from the pattern. It is the culmination of the pattern. There is a third option that some analysts have proposed, though it is more dramatic than either pure confrontation or pure appeasement. This option involves what scholars call tripwire deterrence. Europe would deploy a meaningful military presence to Greenland, with clear orders to resist any attempt at seizure. The presence would not be sufficient to defeat an American invasion, but it would ensure that any American military action would require killing Allied soldiers. The political cost of that outcome might deter the action itself. This option carries enormous risks. It could provoke rather than deter. It could fracture NATO immediately rather than preserving it through the crisis. It could trigger exactly the military confrontation it is designed to prevent. But it would also send an unmistakable signal that European red lines exist and that crossing them has consequences. The very extremity of the measure might convince Trump that Europe is finally serious. The debate over tripwire deployment reflects a deeper question about what kind of threat Trump represents. If he is fundamentally a bluffer who backs down when confronted with credible resistance, then escalation works. If he is genuinely willing to use military force against allies to achieve territorial expansion, then escalation leads to disaster. No one knows which version of Trump will manifest in any given situation, because Trump himself may not know until the moment arrives. What is clear is that the European strategy of the past year has failed. The Turnberry Agreement, celebrated last July as a triumph of pragmatic diplomacy, now looks like an expensive illusion. Europe accepted 15% tariffs on most goods. Europe promised hundreds of billions in American investment. Europe avoided public confrontation, and in return, Europe received tariff threats tied to territorial demands, dismissive rhetoric about European sovereignty, and a breakdown in transatlantic relations unprecedented in the alliance's history. The question for European leaders is no longer whether appeasement works. The evidence is in. Appeasement does not work. The question is what to do now that appeasement has failed. The options are unpalatable. Confrontation is costly and risky. Continued accommodation is humiliating and ineffective. Military deterrence is dangerous and potentially catastrophic. There is no good move, only less bad moves. This is what happens when a revisionist power decides to upend an existing order. The defenders of that order face choices that range from painful to disastrous. But the worst option may be continuing to pretend that the old approach still has merit. Continuing to hope that the next concession will satisfy. Continuing to believe that personal relationships and careful diplomacy can manage a leader who responds to accommodation with contempt. That approach has been tried. It has failed. And every day that Europe delays choosing a different approach is a day that Trump interprets as confirmation that pressure works. The T-Rex metaphor has its limits. Trump is not a dinosaur. He is a human being with human motivations, however difficult to predict. But the underlying insight of the metaphor applies. There are threats that do not respond to stillness. There are predators who interpret caution as weakness. There are situations where the only way to avoid being consumed is to demonstrate that consumption would cost more than it is worth. Europe has the tools to impose costs. It has the Anti-Coercion Instrument. It has 93 billion euros in prepared retaliatory tariffs. It has regulatory authority over digital markets, carbon emissions, and financial services that American companies depend on. It has 450 million consumers whose market access American exporters value. It has cards. The question is whether it is willing to play them. The decision will be made in the coming days and weeks. EU ambassadors are meeting in Brussels. Leaders are consulting by phone. Davos provides a venue for direct conversations. The February 1st deadline approaches. At some point, the talking will end and the actions will begin. Whatever Europe decides, the era of appeasement is over. The question is, what replaces it? And the answer to that question will determine not just the outcome of the Greenland crisis, but the shape of transatlantic relations for the next generation. The predator is watching. The prey must decide whether to run, to freeze, or to turn and fight.